Welcome back to the Power Market Podcast. I'm Ryan McMakin, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And with me are two of our contributing editors, Connor O'Keefe and Tho Bishop. And both write columns for us. Both have new content this week, so we're going to incorporate a little bit of both into our discussion today. And this is our current events podcast. This is our most casual podcast where we're just talking about what happened over the week, drawing upon some of the articles we've written, and really just trying to recap what's going on out there in just some more laid-back tones. So, guys, did any of you watch that Ted Cruz interview, I guess, with Tucker? I mean, I guess it was an interview, more of a humiliation for Ted Cruz is probably what I would discuss it. Although, of course, as with anything on the internet, people are going to like Ted Cruz anyway. Thought he did fine. People who are inclined to not like Ted Cruz are going to eat it up because it did expose that Ted Cruz just doesn't really know much about what's going on out there. But if you're a follower of his, you don't care. That's just how I find the internet works. What I guess I am interested in is how like a normal person who's maybe not familiar with Ted Cruz at all would watch this and think, wow, what is this guy talking about? Now,
I want to find this person who doesn't know who Ted Cruz is.
Keeping track of this. Well, Ted was on the Tucker show, right? So it was a big, long interview. And I guess I'll let Tho really kind of do a rundown of the basic details here. But the important thing is right, this was the Tucker Carlson show, which has millions of viewers on Twitter at any given time, right? This is a high traffic, lots of people see it, lots of people break it up into clips, and Texas Senator Ted Cruz goes on the show, which, wow, I can't believe he agreed to do that. And he was asked a variety of questions by Tucker, and just some of his responses were just really quite astounding. So, Tho, I guess I'll let you kind of get into the details of what I call astounding. I mean, what was your takeaway? And then just kind of take us into some of the pieces of this interview that we should probably talk about in some more detail.
Well, first, I don't want to yada over just like how unique this sort of content really is in the grand scheme of things, because to me, like, this is the closest thing we got to Tucker at the peak of his power at Fox News, because obviously his show is doing very well in alternative media. You know, you see the views on Twitter, you see the views on YouTube, right? But his major role, and he was particularly good at this during foreign policy events during Trump 1.0, was that he would have his monologue on Fox News, Donald Trump's favorite cable news platform, and he'd be able to bring in Republican politicians and skewer them, for a 5, 7, 10-minute segment. And that was something that Republicans did not, they recognized that as sort of a dangerous thing to do. And so here you had the best of both worlds, where it was Tucker unleashed. It was Cruz coming on at a period of significant policy discussions. And you get 2 hours of this. And the last time, outside of like a campaign where you get very opportunistic, whatever campaign sort of stuff, like seeing a discussion on really deep theoretically divides within a much broader sphere of foreign policy conversation going on right now, I think it was very fascinating to see. And I feel like we're not going to get that going forward based on how this turned out. But like, I think that itself, just as a unique contribution to the broader political content discussion apparatus, is itself noteworthy. And then you get the conversation, and again, Senator Cruz is one of probably the smartest members of the legislature, regardless of what you think about his political views, right? I mean, he's Ivy League guy, high IQ, trained lawyer, right? A lot of that was government stuff, so not necessarily out there in the arena per se, but still, like, I mean, he's a world-class debate champion, whatever. And having a lot of the stuff that he was trying to pitch just be rolled from underneath him, becoming a laughing stock. Obviously, he has his defenders. If you already like Ted Cruz's position, then you're going to rally around the flag, whatever, and you're going to defend him. But I think the key takeaways from that have real substantive meaning are, for one, his bringing in his own theology right? Which definitely shapes, I think, the way a large percentage of, particularly a certain generation of Republican views Iran in particular, but Middle Eastern views in particular, right? That was brought up and skewered. You had the conversation about AIPAC and Israeli lobbying in the broader sphere, which Tucker has talked about with Thomas Massey in the past, who has a bit of a different point of view on that. And you have, again, the complete disinterest in a lot of, like the demographics of the area. You get some fun cattiness, the immediate move to like using the anti-Semitic slur and things like that from Cruz when pushed up against the wall, which is the way that a lot of these conversations tend to go throughout the last several decades and the like. And to me, and the purpose of my article is that, ignoring our broader concerns about, military conflict and the consequences of war, particularly domestically and everything else, the key assumption that is driving the mainstream view on the need to have a red line over the nuclear question with Iran in particular, that is therefore the catalyst for everything else around it, is the specific idea that Iran is a uniquely irrational actor, that they're going to be the first country to get a nuclear bomb, the second country to get a nuclear bomb and use it offensively. And it's because of the theology of their government, whose top priority is, mushroom clouds in Tel Aviv and New York City, and et cetera. And that's where just the history of the current Iranian state is very flawed. And you can see this by the way that the Iranian government was willing to provide military assistance to the United States government after 9/11. And when you can recognize and start poking these holes in and I believe that Cruz is probably more or less sincere with the views that he had there, right? I think that he was, I think that he had a lot of confidence in his own ability to communicate a worldview that would persuade people on the fence here. And I think that if you did not go in there lock, stock, and barrel with the Cruz position, you came around from that just not particularly respecting the intellectual rigor by which people like Senator Cruz is looking at these larger foreign policy conversations here. And obviously Cruz's position is the mainstream position of, I think, most of members of Congress in DC. You've had other senators come out talking about the need for regime change and going that far and the like. But I think the Cruz interview in particular is interesting to the extent that it was a public demonstration of these very, I think, sincerely held views of people with power. And it hits on this much broader generational divide that Tucker Carlson certainly is a image of this growing just pushback, the blowback of the consequences of the Bush era being able to manifest itself in a very public, deep, though at times hostile and even downright catty, 2-hour-long conversation with an independent media.
Well, let's look at some of those questions, right? You mentioned that Cruz brought some of his theology into it, right? And that was the first part of the interview I saw, was people started breaking out pieces of the interview and they posted that. And so Tucker starts asking Cruz about why basically he's obsessed with the state of Israel. And Cruz starts talking about how he, as a Christian, believes he is commanded by the Bible to defend Israel. I guess in his mind, that means to defend it with the might of the U.S. government, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. And he wouldn't make a distinction between whatever it was he considered to be Israel and the state of Israel. And Tucker specifically tried to make that distinction, right? Because Cruz says, well, the Bible says, and I mean, this is why Cruz looked so bad, is because Tucker would say, why do you believe this? And Cruz would say, well, because it's in the Bible. And Tucker would say, where in the Bible? Cruz doesn't know. He doesn't even know what book it's in, right? I mean, who cares what verse, right, if you're asking in this sort of form? But maybe you should know, like, is it in the New Testament? Is it in the Old Testament? I mean, that would seem relevant, right? Cruz didn't even know. Tucker knew. He knew it was in Genesis. And then he starts asking for details, and Cruz says, "Yeah, it commands us to support Israel." He says, "So the Bible," as Tucker says, "so the Bible commands you to support the Israeli government?" And Cruz says, "No, I didn't say it says that. It just says to support Israel." But it's clear from the way that discussion proceeded was that Cruz makes no distinction between whatever it is he considers to be Israel, right? And that was a bone of contention as well, as like, okay, so it says the word Israel in this ancient text, and you're assuming that means the modern state of Israel. And that was something that Cruz admitted. Yeah, he's just saying, yeah, it's mentioned here, so it must mean the country currently labeled as Israel on a map. That's basically Cruz's position. And I mean, and I'm not making a theological claim here. Some people might say, yeah, that position makes perfect sense. Fine. But the fact that he wouldn't make a distinction between the people he calls Israel and the government of the modern secular state of Israel was very interesting. And the fact that Cruz made no distinction whatsoever between supporting Israel, whatever that means, and forcing the taxpayers to pay for U.S. government military action there. All of that stuff in Cruz's mind is all just basically jumbled up in one big ball, and none of the distinctions about who's doing what, who's the government, who's not, none of that was relevant to him. He didn't care about any of that. He just, in his mind, had some kind of idea that there's this thing called Israel out there, and therefore the U.S. government has to defend it. And again, what does that even mean? What does defending it mean? And so there was so much lack of precision and so much lack of curiosity in some of the details in this discussion that it was really shocking that Cruz seemed to think this was okay, because he doubled down on it later. So just that discussion all by itself was just really eye-opening, I thought.
Yeah, and not to monopolize the conversation with Connor, but just the point to your mention there is that, again, after this interview came out, he tweeted, he was retweeting David Friedman, who was Trump's ambassador to Israel the first time around, and Ted Cruz reiterates, yes, Tucker really argued that when the Bible says Israel, it doesn't mean Israel. So like this wasn't just a comment that he had there. He doubled down on this in writing, to the extent that X is writing, afterwards on this point. So like this was not just sloppy talk during an interview or not making clear what he said. He doubled down on this afterwards.
Yeah, and that I think is one example of like how this whole interview went. This was one topic, but I think what really stood out to me was how Socratic Tucker's method was here. He wasn't really, for the bulk of it, he wasn't really like arguing like directly against what Cruz was laying out. He was just asking follow-up questions, and Cruz just kept completely falling apart. One or two follow-up questions in, and it really started right from the jump with what I thought was sort of the thing that stood out the most to me was how Ted Cruz was like completely unwilling to be specific about what he meant by regime change. The only thing he laid out was that, you could help move towards regime change by essentially talking tough against, the other regime and speaking in, a mean way about, the regime in Tehran was essentially all he was willing to defend. And like, then he was sort of acting as if that is the question and that is what everybody is debating. And those of us that are against regime change, we're just like so upset about that. And it's like, no, if that was the extent of what these war hawks were arguing for, like we don't have a problem with them saying mean things about the regime in Tehran. That is not the actual debate that everybody's having right here. But by pretending it is, he's able to sort of present himself as this very reasonable party within that whole discussion. And then just by asking a few follow-up questions, Tucker dismantled that sort of illusion. And the same thing happened with AIPAC. Like he skirted the question, like, has AIPAC ever taken a public stance that was different than the Israeli government? And Ted Cruz was like, oh yeah, all the time. And he asked for one example, and Cruz was able to pivot the discussion away. And you are right. Like, Cruz is quite good at this. I think he's potentially one of the best debaters that they have. And so this could have gone worse for him. He was able to sort of pivot the conversation away at certain points. But I think any honest viewer watching it, like, he just kept falling apart because what he's actually arguing for here is so empty. It's so hollow. And just by asking questions about it, Tucker was really able to expose that.
Well, and I think this whole broader debate is itself fascinating because, for one, like within the past week, right, we've seen these fractures within this broader Trump coalition right, really present themselves in foreign policy, which understandably so when you have this sort of pressure point. And part of this broader discussion, this genuine sort of intellectual discussion going on right now, and again, I think a lot of this is generational, and Tucker has hit this with a number of his different themes over time, it's not simply about kind of re-debating the Bush era wars, though those have particular relevance when we're talking about the Middle East. But it's this broader conversation about the consequence of, even obvious military victories on the side of America or allies, right? This is why Tucker has spent a lot of time talking about World War II and, how, Britain won, how the victorious side of the UK, right? Churchill's this great guy. What's the state of the UK today? America, wins World War II, win the Cold War, and yet, we have all these problems in America today. And all these are very interesting conversations about historical revisionism, about foreign policy, about, sometimes in directions I don't particularly like some of the broader sort of economic critiques out there and the policy answers that come from that. But there's a lot of real serious fundamental debate that is going on within Republican intellectual circles, not obvious ones, but just the discourse that's playing out with voters, a lot of younger people. I mean, there's a lot of tweets out there about how demoralizing this past week has been for 30-year-old Trump staffers, that, foreign policy was a big deal to it. And that has been reflected with different personnel choices and some of the schisms there, which I think are all very interesting to follow here. But if you're having policymakers whose top consumption of media continues to be Fox News, and one of the reports out there is a New York Times report about how Trump's public posturing changed based off of sort of the Fox News celebration of the strikes, last Friday, and so is that there is this very real generational divide in how you're consuming this content. That I don't know if someone like Cruz has ever engaged with someone who would question even the domestic value of a successful military confrontation with Iran, right? Let's say the rosiest picture came about, and that the concerns that Iran would simply be Iraq 2.0 are not found. That's not what happens. Then there's still damage that goes on with the use of resources and things like that. That the American interest is not simply military victories that go well. It's that there's a trade-off and a consequence to the domestic population as a result of any military power used elsewhere, that there's a moving of resources over there. And again, these are all conversations that used to be very commonplace in Congress, right? I mean, you read Republican congressmen during the 1940s leading up to World War II, right? These are a lot of the conversations going on now. They've been completely absent from the true political conversation for decades now. And part of that is just the consequence of public finance and the kind of ignoring, the inconvenient truths. But again, that's where, again, a lot of this conversation highlights a lot of very real, deeper divides, that a conflict like this, should you get direct military involvement, is only going to further bring to the top and then end up leading to some fracturing that's going to have domestic political consequences, ignoring all the other arguably more serious outcomes of a direct military engagement.
Well, one thing I've seen... Oh, go ahead, Connor.
I was going to say, I wonder how unaware Cruz is of all that, because he did spend a lot of the debate, discussion, whatever you want to call it, talking about recent military or interventions that did go poorly. He talked about Syria. He talked about the Iraq War II in negative ways. And it felt like he kind of looked at this as, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to talk the non-interventionists back from the ledge. And so he was trying to sort of say, hey, I'm with you when it comes to Libya. I'm with you when it comes to Syria and all this stuff. But then, when he would just sort of assert that Iran is different, and he just never backed that up with anything. So I wonder how much this reflects them being unaware of sort of this sort of discourse and how it's bubbling up, versus just being aware of it and having absolutely no way to counter it when you're in a setting where somebody can ask a follow-up question.
Well, I think the problem was that they just are surprised that there was any pushback on this topic, that they just figured, I don't have to say my reasoning behind this, and my traditional conservative followers are going to do what they're told, and I can always count on them to support the next war. whatever that may be. And certainly that has been true really up until recently. Certainly was true with the wars of the Bush administration. And it was all the usual rally around the flag. It was all the usual don't question the government because there are people at the top who have secret knowledge and you shouldn't question them. And I'm sure everything's great. The CIA just isn't telling you everything. So you can never oppose what the government does because we must assume that everything the government does is based on special virtue, knowledge, and information that they're not sharing with the rest of us. Now, how you can have that position and still claim to support freedom in any way is pretty ridiculous in my mind, but that is a pretty common conservative position, at least among a certain age group. I think among the younger age group, they're finally starting to realize what a scam that is. But when we get into some of these little discussions, though, I think it just brings us back to the issue of we have to avoid arguing on their terms, right? Because I noticed that when he was talking about what his biblical views were and all that sort of thing, it then immediately spurred discussion in social media where all these people were debating each other about how to interpret the Old Testament. And I thought that was pretty remarkable, but also totally beside the point in the sense of public policy. Because you'll notice that the assumption is that Cruz is essentially saying, well, this is how I interpret it, and therefore this automatically leads to the conclusion that the United States should be involved in this war. But it seems to me, and he also, Tucker drew out of him basically saying that part of the reason he joined the U.S. Senate was so that he could make sure that the protection of the state of Israel by the United States government was a priority at all times in Washington, D.C. He said that was absolutely one of his most important things in the whole wide world about being a U.S. senator. And what he's basically saying is that as a representative of the people of Texas, my biggest priority is to make sure that they are taxed to pay and support for a foreign government. This is a man who took an oath to protect the United States Constitution, and his biggest priority is to help a foreign government, which, whatever your theology is, right, he can believe whatever he wants about what the book of Genesis says. But if your overriding political position is that I take my orders from this ancient scripture, and therefore it's my right to tell American boys to go die in some foreign land, to tell the taxpayers to pay more money, to involve the U.S. government in more foreign wars, if that is what you believe stems rightly from your religious views, and if your religious views also dictate to you that the U.S. government is required to do all these things, that's disqualifying in my view. If you believe that your theological views give you a right to bind taxpayers and others to fulfill your theological goals, you shouldn't be a member of the U.S. Senate. You certainly should be free to believe whatever you want, but though that view is incompatible with an oath to the U.S. Constitution. And so I just don't see how he can get up and say that, and that anyone can still support this guy or think he should be in the Senate. I'm not interested in debating the theology of it. All I can say is that if your theology says that your job in the U.S. Senate is to use the U.S. government as a tool to accomplish your theology, then you're disqualified.
Well, and I think there's parallels too, because like if you listen to someone like Mitch McConnell, for example, and obviously Cruz and McConnell have not been the best of buds during their time there. But if you listen to Mitch McConnell, who I also think is a serious guy, like for all the other shady stuff he does, like I mean he's a serious, you know.
Well, there's plenty of evil people that are serious, intelligent people. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
But I think one, and it's less theologically driven, but you know I think that he sees as one of his priorities of holding political power is the maintenance and maintaining of the post-war order and the alliances with Europe, right? And so he sees, you know, very much within that Cold War mentality, right, that checking Russia, that maintaining the post-World War II global order is the highest priority and more important than even domestic issues, because that is it within this core DNA of what he thinks is the good. And Cruz, being several decades younger, right? I mean, he was in his 30s during the Bush era. He says he was against the Iraq War. I'm a little skeptical of that. I don't think there's really any real record of that, but neither here nor there. But so that same dynamic is that McConnell views our alliance with NATO on similar religious, almost near religious sort of views that Cruz views our relationship with Israel, and a lot of Republicans from that generation hold that same view. And what's interesting about this particular situation is that, unlike Iraq War I, where you had Colin Powell and the case for the intelligence case being made publicly, and even privately, came from American intel sources. Again, reporting has come out, and I think it's fairly decent reporting, that it was the Israeli government that had the intelligence of Iran getting that close to a bomb, right? That American intelligence sources could not confirm the Israeli sources here. And so this is Cruz prioritizing the viewpoints of the Israeli intelligence services and ultimately the judgment of Netanyahu, because that's where all this comes in. And this is where it's going to be interesting after the fact, is that American foreign policy at this point is being directed entirely by Netanyahu. Trump did not want Israel to attack. He didn't stop them. He didn't want it. He wanted another weekend of diplomacy at best, right? And so Netanyahu acted, and now the entire mission of Cruz and Tom Tillis and a lot of the Republicans is outsourcing our next foreign policy decisions to Israel because of the way that they see the sacred-state relationship there. And again, that is a particular view that is falling apart as you get younger in generations right now. That's why I don't think Vance buys that. Right. There's and that has been one of the bulwarks, is that it's people like Vance. For any other issues you might have with Vance, he does not share that same underlying worldview when it comes to alliances, whether it's with Europe or with Israel, that Cruz does.
And I guess that was like something a bit refreshing about it. Is one thing, at least, that annoys me about foreign policy, especially, is that politicians tend to dance around like that chief motivation that they have, like what you're talking about with McConnell. And, he'll go off about how it's about democracy and stuff, and he'll kind of repeat the buzzwords as if it's just a question of there being ballots in Kiev or not. And when it came to Cruz, I thought it was similar with the theology. It's like, if that is a chief motivation for you, be honest with that, be upfront, and then we can kind of examine that and dig into it. I think Tucker, at other points, was sort of pecking away at these other excuses, I think, is a good way to characterize them, that Cruz was putting forward, which, it's like the nukes, the trying to kill Trump. I actually thought I had some issues with how Tucker was going after him. I understood the point he was making was that you don't actually believe that there's like an imminent threat on Trump's life, because otherwise then, we should be directly attacking Iran and trying to expose that. I understand that. I don't love the idea of just like putting that out there, like, hey, to get the right-wing skeptics on board here, all you have to do is show some evidence that they're going to do. Like, I was a bit uncomfortable with that, but I understood the broader point of that kind of angle of attack. And so, yeah, like, I am not convinced by what, the 2 minutes Cruz spent talking about that theology stuff, but I do at least appreciate that. Like, I think people should be more honest with, like, what is the actual reason that they are, arguing for a foreign intervention or against a foreign intervention. I just think that's a broader problem in our foreign policy discourse.
Well, that brings us to the issue of how are they going to pay for all this? I mean, it's quite remarkable that the United States is talking about a major war with a country with 90 million people, which another number that Ted Cruz didn't know. He had no idea, like not even a ballpark of how many people live in Iran, which, by the way, is completely relevant to its war-making capability. Cruz tried to say, oh, it doesn't have anything to do with anything, the population of Iran. Yeah, anyone who knows anything about foreign policy knows that population is related to GDP, is related to your ability to build large, like an industrial warfare machine and all of that. And Cruz is actually like, no, they could have 1 million, they could have 90 million. What difference does it make to their war-making capacity? I mean, this is the level these people are functioning on.
And the breakdown of demographics is usually pretty important when we're talking about what comes after. Typically, the stability of the regime that comes after, typically, the demographics of the nation typically has.
Well, in ignoring the Sunni-Shia divide in Islam was one of the blunders that became obvious in Iraq, right? Where the U.S. war in Iraq ended up actually pushing a lot of the Shia minority much more into Iran's orbit. Iraq now became more of an Iran-affiliated country after the U.S. invasion, which was contrary to what the U.S. stated was the whole purpose of the whole thing. And so these are the sorts of facts that don't trouble Ted Cruz because they have nothing to do with anything. And I mean, it's just astounding how the conservative movement, how the United States culture in general is just really degenerated in terms of what it's willing to tolerate, in terms of ignorance, in terms of just pretending like basic information about the world is just irrelevant. I just make up my mind what wars I want, and then we do them, and facts don't matter. 19th century Americans weren't nearly that delusional, but somehow by the 21st century, that's just how we work in politics. But speaking of delusion, right, I think this could take us into some of these related issues, because this was a week where the Fed met. There was an FOMC meeting, and
oh yeah,
they came out. Remember that? And it was on Wednesday, and they decided to not change the target policy interest rate, the federal funds rate, keep it at 4.5%, which is where it's been since November, I believe, maybe at their December meeting. But they lowered it. They started lowering again in the fall after they had raised it by 100 basis points from 2022 to 2024. They then lowered it slightly. And that was considered to be kind of odd, right? Because the economy really wasn't doing that poorly at the time, and they lowered the interest rate a lot, and now they're not doing anything with the interest rate. So there's all these conspiracy theories about is Powell doing this to try and hurt Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And what Trump is saying a lot about it is this is such typical Trump, right? Trump, after bad-mouthing the Europeans forever and talking about how the Europeans are stupid and everything, is now saying, well, why can't the Federal Reserve be more like the European Central Bank? The Europeans, they got it figured out. They're doing monetary policy right. Now, first of all, I don't know how anyone who cares anything about like markets or like just decent economic anything would think that the European Central Bank is something you should want to emulate. But that's what Trump's saying. It's like, oh, look, the ECB keeps cutting the target rate. Jerome Powell should be doing the same thing. Yeah, okay. I guess we should be more like Europe, which is an interesting. Well, I guess America First is so 2024. We're not on that anymore. But so Trump's whole monetary policy is bizarre, and he wants more cuts. He wants more easy money. He wants more monetary inflation. And he's pointing to other banks and saying he wants that. But I guess that makes sense, is that's the only way you could even possibly think that you could pay for another war with a large country like Iran. How else is he going to pay for this? First of all, he's running up $2 trillion per year deficits. That's kind of a generous number. It's probably going to be higher than that by the end of the year. It's going to be the same next year and the year after. It's going to be $5 trillion higher by the time Trump leaves office, at least, maybe $6. And so where is he going to get this extra? First of all, the U.S. wasted $1 trillion in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So how much more is it going to cost for this much larger country in Iran if he becomes truly involved there? Where's he going to get that money? It's going to have to be printed. It's going to have to be borrowed. It's going to push far more huge amounts of deficit spending. It's going to mean that the Treasury Department is going to have to issue huge amounts of bonds. And what's that going to do? It's going to raise the interest rate, because they're going to have to raise the interest rate in order to get investors to buy this extra $500 billion per year, whatever it is they're going to have to spend in deficit spending to fund this war. So then what's the Fed going to have to do? Is going to have to come and print money and buy up those bonds in order to keep the interest rate from getting completely out of control. So I just wonder if he's paying attention to this at all, or if the Fed is just a purely political thing for him, that he sees it strictly in terms of he wants some stimulus out of the Fed, because that seems to be what the current game is, right? Is in Trump's mind, it seems, lower inflation rate, or rather lower interest rate, means number go up. And by number, he means like the stock market, so that he can therefore go on Truth Social and brag about how much higher the stock market is. That seems to be his motivation. Although he did mention, he's finally mentioning publicly that one of the reasons he thinks that the Fed should cut interest rates is because he wants cheaper borrowing. And he just came straight out and said that. We need to borrow more cheaply. Well, how does he think that is accomplished? It's accomplished by monetary inflation. So he's outright begging for more monetary inflation. We'll also claim that he got rid of inflation because eggs got cheaper. Wow. We all know housing so much more affordable, higher ed, affordable, healthcare. It's all getting more affordable in Trump's mind. And so he thinks he solved inflation. But the Fed actually is looking out there and it's seeing that the Fed's got more than 2.5% in its preferred inflation measure. Inflation hasn't gone away. You'll recall that in last fall, the Fed was saying, oh, we're lowering the target interest rate because we've solved inflation. It's heading rapidly back to our 2% target. That never happened. Here we are 7 months later. It's still well above that. So there's perfectly good reasons for the Fed to not keep lowering its interest rate. But I see all these MAGA people coming out and saying, why isn't Powell lowering? These are people who claim to be for sound money, mind you. These are people who claim to be for fiscal responsibility. And they're out there whining and complaining that the Fed hasn't cut the interest rate more because they want more easy money. Why do they want more easy money? Because it make number go up and make Donald Trump look better. So everything's like on its head, right? All these conservatives say they want sound money. No, we need more easy money. Why? To make Trump look better. And Trump's saying, oh, I don't need stimulus anymore. Inflation solved. We need to borrow more. We need more deficit spending. So he's just coming right out and saying, yeah, I want to spend more money. I want more deficits, make a cheaper Fed. And I don't care how much you have to inflate the money supply. I mean, you never know what these people are going to say next because it's just so bonkers. So I don't know what's happening.
Well, I think it is predictable to know what they're going to say next because what you're seeing is, I mean, and we can argue this is one of the positive spins of it is that it's the perception of the Fed as an explicitly political actor. And so the Fed is being attacked because the Fed's not doing what Trump wants it to do because they don't view this as an independent central bank. They see it as a political actor. And again, like that rate cut that they had last year, right, was probably a political action to try to bail out the Democrats back then. And so like that critique and that broader cynicism, the Fed has invited it in its own right because of how explicit it's been. Obviously, the Fed has never been independent, right? And so when we're seeing that entire facade breakdown, it comes to mind Joe Salerno's humble proposal for Fed policy to just completely explicitly make monetary policy political by outsourcing it outside of independent experts in the class and the like. But that is what all of this has come down to, is the Fed is now just seen as simply another political arena, which is healthy in terms of the perception of monetary authorities. But obviously it would be, if the answer is just more easy money and more reinflating various bubbles, then that's going to have long-term consequences there. And a lot of this goes to, again, this is the thing that I remember, right after Trump's election in 2024, one of the big takeaways that I think certain people of the Trump team have recognized and are trying to manage is that the economy that was inherited in 2024 is fundamentally different than it was in 2016 because of just the extremism of monetary policy during COVID. And so a lot of that slack, we can also talk about like Janet Yellen and like her refinancing of debt like in short-term measures that is causing a lot of that immediate tension in terms of refinancing right now. But there's a lot less slack in the line than what Trump was able to enjoy the first time around, where he was similarly going after Powell, right? Similarly calling for low interest rates, even as there were gains in the economy, if you measured by wages and things like that, partly because of deregulation and some of the tax cuts and things like that, right? So even the real economic growth that was being measured by not just simply GDP, but the sort of real Main Street sort of measurements that have real value, he was still clamoring there because Trump knows that low interest rates are that cheap money is good for blowing up a bubble. I mean, he communicated this as a candidate, and then you don't want to be the president when those things pop, right? You don't want to be the president in charge of a bubble popping there. And so I don't find this rhetoric particularly surprising. I think it's largely political or predictable, but it's predictable because of the political takeover of everything.
I think that's sort of that's like the broader point as far as I see it, at least. And I think what we really need to capitalize on is sort of that optical side of this. And it's sort of a broader, like this, I think, is one of my favorite things about the Trump administration. It was the same thing in his first term, but it's especially true this time around that there's kind of this dynamic where Trump sort of brings out like all of these aspects of DC and how the federal machine works that and like he brings them into the light and exaggerates them. And it's all the stuff that like the political establishment doesn't really want the American people to be aware of. So like you'll take something like money in politics, like they're trying to freak out or get everybody freaked out that Trump is like, giving political favors to people that were like paid him money or did him favors. I remember that especially in his first term, it was like the most corrupt administration in history, like as if that hasn't been a core aspect of our political system for hundreds of years at this point. And it was the same thing. I wrote an article last week about using media access to kind of favor some outlets that are friendlier to him as opposed to others. Like that has been like the way that presidents especially have been control or helping to put their thumb on the scale for media coverage going back to like 1900 basically. And yet they're trying to act like Trump just brought this brand new dynamic to Washington. And it's the same thing with like these parts of the government. So you're hearing it the same thing about the FBI and the CIA, or like, Kash Patel is for the first time ever politicizing the FBI. And that's complete nonsense. But I really think the Fed is the Fed is sort of the core to all this. It's the one that they really can't have that impression catch on amongst the public. The FBI, like all these different parts of the government, they're kind of like the heads of the Hydra, whereas the Fed is like the heart of the whole thing. It's the thing that allows all this other stuff to get funded, and it allows it to continue. So I really expect as we see Trump get more, I guess you could say, honest about how he sees the Fed, like the way he sees the Fed is like how it's worked this whole time, and it just has a lot of potential to really break down the illusion that this is this like magically independent part of the federal government that's not really part of the federal government, and they're just completely immune from thinking about the political interest. To the extent that Trump keeps dragging this out into the light and sort of exposing the way it really works, there's potential for that to be productive.
Well, and Trump mentioning how the reason he wants lower interest rates is to lower federal borrowing costs. That's a perfect example right there, right? He's saying something that we're not actually supposed to say, that a big purpose of the central bank is to just make it easier for the government to borrow. And that's always been true, right? This was a point that Alex Pollock makes when he mentions the Fed is, look, Napoleon founded the modern central bank, so he would always have someone to lend him money. And the Bank of England founded to help the king in terms of his financing, which turned into the financing of the state. These central banks were founded by regimes to help the regime. But so much of the discussion around it still has this naive view of, the central bank, they want to bring down inflation. The central bank, they want to help regular people. And of course, Powell pushes that. Everything the Fed is nonstop propaganda. Of course, Powell comes out at his press conferences, and the first stuff he talks about is how we recognize that inflation hurts the common man, and we want to do something about it. We want to help return price stability to help the common man. They don't care about any of that. The central bank exists for the ruling class to help it. That's why it was founded. That's why it exists. That's why it does what it does. And all of this stuff about regular people, that's just to add political justification to the existence of this institution, right? You have to like make believe that you're doing something for the general population. Otherwise, there's no justification in a system that claims to be democratic for your existence as an organization. That's what the regime always does. They always claim to be serving the people. Of course, they're not, but they have to do that dog and pony show. And that's something you have to just always keep in mind with the central bank. And you're right, the mask is starting to come off a little bit, maybe just because of Trump and the sorts of things he says. And I would agree. That's all to the best. I think that brings us to our last topic here, just a last couple of minutes here. But one of the articles I liked this week also at the site was called Trump, Doge, and the Machiavellians. And this was by one of our writers named Artis Shepard. But this fits right into what you were talking about, right? Is that there's always a level of deception with these institutions. And it's true. He mentions the Machiavellians, mentions Machiavelli, right? The more I read Machiavelli, right? I had to read Machiavelli in college and consulted him in graduate school and things like that. But I've gone back to just kind of like do some refreshers. And man, this stuff is ever new, right? It never gets old. Like this, it was written the 15th century. It's like it could have been written last week, just in terms of the need to, the way you share bad news all at once, but you share the good news a little bit at a time to keep reminding the public about all the great stuff you're doing. Just the absolute centrality of deception, because the people fall for it over and over again, and that's your primary tool then in ensuring that your regime continues to have some sort of legitimacy. And that's a point that Shepard makes here, is that the whole exercise around Doge, with Musk, with Trump, there's so much performance, right? So much of it is performative. So much of it is just giving a show to the population to make it look like they're doing all of these good things that they know that their base will like. And in the end, so nothing of substance happens in most cases, right? Remember, all of this stuff that was mentioned over during the Doge period, right? Oh, we're going to audit the Fed. We're going to audit all the gold in Fort Knox. We're going to cut $1 trillion. They keep saying these things, and then people get excited, and then it's dropped. Nobody ever mentions it again. And you can just see the deception element, but it places in people's mind, like advertising, like a good feeling, like a little dopamine hit. Oh, look, Trump's doing this great thing I like. He must be good. And then you completely forget about the details of it, but you remember that Trump is doing things you like. And I think it's extremely effective. And these are very intelligent people. Artists touches on that a little bit. But I just am reminded again and again about how what these institutions are actually doing, what the money is actually being spent on. None of it could survive the light of day if people actually spent time discovering all of these things that the central government is doing at any given time. It would absolutely destroy their very idea of the legitimacy of the state, because it's absolutely opposed to what it is that people think the government should be doing or what they want the government doing with their money. People slaving hours a day at their jobs, giving all this money over to the federal government because they think it's going to something that's in their interest, and then it turns out none of it is. And that's the reason they never want to share any of it. They deny freedom of information requests all the time now. They delay on that. It's like that law barely has any effect anymore. Everything is classified. They don't want to release any information that embarrasses them. I mean, we live under basically a regime that is defined by secrets and keeping secrets. And if they're dribbling out some information, it's because they think it will make them look good most of the time. And that's the system. And it's really quite remarkable that people continue to take it all at face value. And so did an interview. And so this must be what this politician thinks. This politician said that must be what they think. This is the stated reason for policy X. So that must be the reason. And so it's just amazing that people keep believing that stuff. And I don't know, maybe we're making some progress on that, but it just seems like we got a long way to go.
Well, I think there's like there's a little bit of an extra step there, though. I agree that, like, dragging things out into the light is productive, but I think a lot of people will notice that. And, you have things like Rand Paul publishes his quarterly report of like the craziest federal spending. And so like there is a lot that's already out there. I think the main issue is that most people just look at that as an exception or a deviation. And I think that there were parts of Doge and how Doge sort of talked about itself that fed into it when they were going to look for waste, fraud, and abuse. It sort of fed this narrative that like the federal government is trying to help people. It's trying to do good things for our economy and for the average person. But every once in a while they make mistakes, so they're a bit wasteful here. And, there's a few bad actors that might do something kind of fraudulent. So I think it's not just exposing like the crazy things that they're doing, but it's helping people to see that that's also the purpose of this whole thing. I think if all of it got exposed at once, there'd be no denying, like, okay, this is clearly not a system that's not working. This is the whole point of the system, which is, a reason that, this stuff is trickling out, as you're kind of saying. But I think that, to me, that was sort of the big disappointment of Doge. Not that I was really expecting much, but like, or one of a better way to say it is the thing that was sort of hampering them from the beginning was that they really accepted this idea that like, it's just some mistakes and maybe on the extreme margin, a few bad actors, when no, it's like that this whole thing is a racket and we're all being ripped off, as you have like that great quote from you, Ryan, about how this is just all about how we're being ripped off. That's the actual reality here. And I think if you don't lead with that, you're just not really going to make any progress.
Well, again, and we kind of saw USAID kind of die in sunlight, right? I mean, pretty quickly, just the insanity there. And that's kind of like the one big victory that you got from Doge, which, hey, is better than no victories at all. But I mean, that's one example of that model playing out in practice that we've seen. And I think that's a big reason why. I mean, again, it's think about how much the world has changed since 1997. Better days. That was the last time you had, and this is going to sound like a wonkish procedural point, but that's the last time like you went through a normal budget process with Congress. It was 1997. And so like, imagine if you had, bringing back to our first topic, right? If you had, a similar sort of debate and discussion with appropriations leaders with the same sort of rigor on alternative media for 2 hours that we had with Tucker and Ted on foreign policy, dealing with the budget, dealing with, the agriculture budget or whatever, put in, committee there. But I think that process would look very different. Like, I think if there's any hope within the system of getting to that point, like that is the way that process would play out. I don't think we're going to see that anytime in the near future, because the whole purpose of the modern state is to prevent precisely this sort of broad discussion about priorities. And so, it keeps on. The state exists to maintain itself. And it's only going to be, again, the idea that we're going to grow ourselves out of the Leviathan, that there's going to be a reform-minded asset, a reform path that solves these very strong structural problems. I'm happy to be, show me someone that changed my opinion. I'm willing to entertain it. But there is no salvation here. There is no reform here. It doesn't matter who you elect, because the one election does not change the entire body. And I think that's, once you recognize that sort of fact, that's what leads to, okay, then what do we as individuals do? And that's where it's, identifying gold, silver, Bitcoin, things that can't be inflated away. It all comes back into your individual discipline on how do you prepare yourself and your family for the broader ramifications, and just trying to, survive the various ties down the ramifications of federal policy, because there is no reform because of the way just the modern state is not structured to have serious discussions about the budget.
All right. Well, that'll have to be it for this episode of the Power and Market Podcast. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Tho, for joining me today. We'll be back next week with more, because, boy, as we said 2 weeks ago, we talked about this war starting a couple of weeks ago, and we had no idea what direction it's going to go in, and we still don't know. And Trump says he's got 2 weeks to decide. So I'll see you guys next week, and we'll see what the issue is. I suspect we can't ditch this topic yet.
2 weeks to stop the spread.
Well, thank you both. Thank you all for listening out there, and we'll see you next time.